This one's going up late, but it's going to be better late than never. War with Moldova, war with Romania, war with NATO. It's been a very hectic day regarding the war in Ukraine, because now there is the potential for a new front to open up outside of Ukraine. What we know for sure is that apparently there were 2 explosions in Transnistria. One at, I believe it was the headquarters of like the Transnistrian KGB. I don't know, I would think a place like Transnistria probably still calls it the KGB. I might be wrong. Maybe it was like their defense ministry, but it was something like that. Something tied to defense or intelligence. And then also a radio tower was blown up. And according to Russia, this was the Ukrainians who did it, which would, kind of make sense. That would be I would think they'd be the prime suspects. Since Moldova has not been very bellicose, and has not been trying to stir things up with Russia, I would be surprised if the Moldovans were the ones moving into Transnistria, or trying to attack them in any way. And then the only suspect after that would be the Ukrainians, because that's Transnistria's only neighbors. It's a long, skinny little strip of land that is bordered by Moldova and Ukraine. Now, for those of you who don't know and aren't interested in topics like this, I find Transnistria incredibly interesting. I've always wanted to visit there, because it is it's a little microstate. It's like Liechtenstein or San Marino or Monaco, except it's not recognized by any other country in the world, which is fine. If I were a country, I wouldn't care what other countries thought of me as long as I was living my best life and being happy. And that's exactly what Transnistria specializes in. Since the fall of the Soviet Union, they basically have not recognized that the Soviet Union has fallen. If you go to Transnistria, it's like stepping back into the Soviet Union. It's really cool. I mean, I would never want to live in the Soviet Union, but it would be a cool thing to visit, because it's the Cold War. I mean, it's history. It'd be like not quite like going to North Korea, but maybe the closest thing outside of that. They still have the hammer and sickle flag. They recently adopted something that looks very, very close to the Russian flag as like an alternate national flag. But you go there, there's hammer and sickle flags flying from the buildings. They've got their Lenin statues. They've got, everything looks very communist. And I just find that cool. No, that doesn't make me a communist. I'm an ANCAP. But I love history. If I could go to like a theme park that was, looked like Nazi Germany, I would do that too. Especially if it was a real place that people still lived in. It doesn't mean I love Nazi Germany. It means I love history. That's something that we used to understand here in America. I mean, Nazis used to be a very popular topic. Everyone loved Nazi movies. The History Channel was nothing. We used to call it the Hitler Channel here in America, because the History Channel was all about Hitler and Nazis, because that's what was entertaining to people. And I feel similarly. I think I feel a lot like how the older generation felt about the Nazis. That's how I feel about the commies. And so I want Transnistria to be preserved, if only for my own selfish, historical interests. I want that place to be intact. I don't want it to get blown up by Ukraine. Now, I should point out before I get too much further, the Ukrainian side, pro-Ukraine Twitter, is saying that this is a false flag staged by the Russians to justify an invasion of Moldova. That's absurd. Russia has not been, overtly hostile to Moldova. They do not have a bad relationship, really, with Moldova. Remember, Moldova uses the Cyrillic alphabet still. Moldova has been trying for a long time to distinguish themselves from Romania because, let's be honest, if Moldova was not a former Soviet Socialist Republic, there's no real reason why it's a country separate from Romania. They speak pretty close to the same language. They have a very, very similar flag. But because they were part of the Soviet Union, they used the Cyrillic alphabet. And so they still have that to try and distinguish themselves from Romanians, even though the Romanians would like to bring Moldova back into Romania during the interwar period when Romania was at its height in terms of territorial expanse. What is now Moldova was a part of Romania. And then, as a result of World War II, Romania was an Axis country. It was a minor Axis country, but it was still aligned with Hitler. Stalin decided to take Moldova, or Moldavia. In fact, I found it's interesting when you talk to people who are older than I am. I'm in my early 20s. They still call these countries in Europe especially get renamed. Every once in a while, you have the new politically correct name. And I've always known Moldova as Moldova. That's what it's been my whole life. But in the case of, my mother, who's obviously significantly older than me, she calls it Moldavia. I've always found that interesting. But that is what it was called during the Soviet Union. Just like how there's still people who call Belarus Belarusia. That's what Belarus was always called until the end of the Soviet Union. And so Stalin annexed Moldavia, which he insisted was a separate country. And I believe historically this was something. Moldavia is basically overlaps with Bessarabia, which was a piece of land that yes, Romanians lived in, but it kind of went back and forth between being under Ottoman or Russian persuasion or influence, whereas what we know as Romania today was always solidly under Ottoman control, or at least Ottoman influence. It was run by Ottoman vassals. But Bessarabia, at different times, was under Russian influence, hence the Cyrillic alphabet. Now, Russia has no claim on the whole of Moldova. They're not trying to restore Soviet Moldavia. That's not happening. That's just, we're so far from that happening. Could that happen one day? I mean, sure, I guess if Russia continued to build itself up, and if the Moldovans decided to go hardline against them, like the Ukrainians do, maybe someday, if the Russians had the opportunity, they would take over Moldova. I'm not saying that could never happen, but that's not happening right now. Russia's very clearly focused on Ukraine and dealing with the problem in Ukraine. They don't want to open up a new problem with Moldova that they don't already have. They have no problem with Moldova right now. The issue in Transnistria has not been an issue since 1992. There was a brief little war. Everybody just sort of, said, hey, let's take a chill pill. The people in Transnistria have no interest in being a part of Moldova. Moldova doesn't really care about Transnistria because there's not really anything there. I believe it's on the other side of a mountain. It's on the Ukrainian side of this mountain, or mountain range, I think. Again, I've never been there. I don't know too much about it. But Transnistria for Moldova is basically out of sight, out of mind. So they're not going to move it in there and try and destabilize these people. It's a happy arrangement. Everyone gets along. But apparently Moldova, I've heard from the Duran, and I don't want to say that this is something that I've gone and double checked, but I hear from them, so I take their word for it. Apparently Transnistria has the largest weapons cache in Europe, or largest ammunition depot, which wouldn't be that shocking. Like, in a lot of these ex-Soviet countries, they had a ton of ammo left over from the Soviet Union. And again, this is old Soviet surplus ammo. At the very newest, it's 31 years old. So a lot, there's probably a lot of dud ammo in there. It's all, corrosive salts. Not stuff that I'd be too enthusiastic about running through my guns. But nevertheless, if the Ukrainians could capture that, it would be very useful to them. The Ukrainians have a lot of old Soviet weaponry, not just AK-74s and Makarovs, but old artillery pieces from the Soviet era. And so I'm not sold on this idea that the Ukrainians, want to invade Transnistria just to take all their weapons. I would need to see more evidence of that. At the very least, I find it more plausible than Russia wanting to stir something up there, stage a false flag in Transnistria to justify their going there. I mean, the Russians are already marching towards Transnistria. The Russians already have troops in Transnistria. The Russians, Transnistria is the one place in the former Soviet Union that the Russians really never left. I mean, I guess you have Sevastopol. That's another exception, but it's not like there's a Russian base in Transnistria. It's just the Russians were there before or during the Soviet Union, and they're there after the Soviet Union. They're just there. And, this is a place in the middle of nowhere, so they're kind of isolated. So in the middle of a war like this, when all of the Russian troops are far away from Transnistria at this moment, they do kind of look like an easy target if you're the Ukrainians and wanted to just go, take out some Russians, maybe attack Transnistria. I'm sure you could capture it pretty easily. And again, other than potentially the ammunition, I don't know what there really is to be gained from there. I guess some people said, oh, well, you can capture soldiers and use them to trade for Ukrainian POWs. Okay. I guess it does kind of mesh with the theme of Ukraine trying to launch strikes inside of Russia, little pinprick strikes, which they have been doing quite a bit, on and off. Transnistria, you really could look at as a part of Russia. So if you're in, southwest Ukraine, and you're a military unit saying, hey, the Ruskies aren't here right now, but what could we do? Oh, well, we could go mess with the Transnistrians, because of course they are largely Russian. Those are the people. The people who seem to be in control in Transnistria are the Russians, even though there are Ukrainians that live in Transnistria. There are Moldovans in Transnistria. But Transnistria, I mean, the Russian flag is a dual national flag for them. They're very clearly, they speak Russian there. It's very clearly a Russia-aligned little statelet. So this could be something as simple as that. The Ukrainians launching pinprick strikes on soft Russian targets. Targets that are perceived to be Russian. This doesn't necessarily have to evolve into something worse. This doesn't necessarily have to evolve into, Russia having to intervene in Transnistria because, Ukraine is, going to knock the place over. And then, Russia gets involved in a war with Moldova, and then Moldova catches the attention of Romania, because, of course, Moldova used to be part of Romania, and Romania doesn't want Moldova falling, back under Russian control. Romania, of course, is a NATO state, and so if Romania gets into a war with Russia, then you have, a NATO country at war with Russia that doesn't necessarily lead to the to NATO intervening. That doesn't trigger Article 5, because Article 5 is a defensive clause. An attack on one is an attack on all, is the shorthand for it. If Romania chose to involve itself in this ongoing war with Russia, that would not be defensive, and so it couldn't invoke Article 5. But the rest of the NATO countries largely, or at least a lot of them, I should say this. So yeah, largely, NATO countries would want to get involved at that point. They'd say, well, look, we can't leave our NATO ally there to fight the Ruskies alone. And, of course, other NATO countries, like, let's say, Hungary, would not want to get involved. And there would be a split within NATO. And I don't think that they would invoke the NATO treaty even, but this would be a split. It's not like you would have countries leaving NATO over it. Maybe you would, but not necessarily. But that would be really that would be a worst-case scenario if Romania got involved here. Because at that point, everybody has their finger on the button. I mean, how does Romania go to war with Russia without the U.S. really being a combatant in that war? Is the U.S. not going to supply arms to a NATO ally? The U.S. is supplying arms to Ukraine, although they're not a NATO ally. They're not even a member of the EU. And so the U.S. would have to do something more for Romania. So when I think about this, I think, gee, who does that benefit? Bringing the war into Moldova and Transnistria sucks in NATO, potentially. There's a good chance that happens. Who does that benefit? Does that benefit the Ruskies? Or does that benefit the Ukrainians? I think that question answers itself. This isn't hard to think about. The Russians at this point, Transnistria was never something that the Russians, I think, were that interested in. That's why they never recognized it. But I think it's something that they sort of felt obligated to take care of. So it's, the Russians, I don't think, feel like they have much of a, vital national interest in Transnistria. But the way this war is going, I do think that they will push all the way to the Moldovan border so that Transnistria will be united. They're so close now. They're in Kherson, and they've raised the Russian flag there, and in all those other cities. They're not leaving. They're marching to Odessa next. Odessa is a culturally important city in Russia. I mean, it's arguably a nice place. There's a lot of places in Eastern Europe that are not very nice. Odessa is an exception to that. And so with the Russians already being in Kherson, I doubt that they would stop short of Odessa. It would just look weird on the map. It would complete things for them to completely cut the Ukrainians off from the sea. And if they do that, they're going to Transnistria. But they don't necessarily have to cross the border and enter Transnistria. At least not yet. They can negotiate with Moldova, because Moldova has a much more reasonable government than Ukraine. The Russians do not need to use force. The Russians worked for many, many years to try to negotiate, what they wanted from Ukraine peacefully. Of course, I say peacefully, there's always a threat of violence when you're talking about two countries negotiating with each other. But, if you're talking, you're not fighting. And I think if the Russians push all the way to the Moldovan border, they can talk to the Moldovans at some point later on. Again, Transnistria is pretty stable. There's not a huge emergency to try and get in there. So the Russians down the road can say, hey, Moldova, those people in Transnistria that don't want to be a part of Moldova, who are right across, right on the border with what is now Russia, with Odessa Oblast. I believe that's what borders Transnistria. I might be wrong. I'm not totally I'm not perfect on Ukrainian geography. But either way, this area that will be part of Russia at some point later on down the road, the Russians can go to the folks in Moldova and say, hey, say this little tiny little strip of land that's like 5 miles wide or something. Why don't we just say it's a part of Russia? Those people there like Russia. They fly the Russian flag. They've never functioned as a part of the post-Soviet Moldovan state. So let's just settle this peacefully. And I think they would. And then there would be no need for any sort of military conflict. There would be no need to get Romania involved. That's the way I would be thinking about this if I were Russia. But if I were Ukraine, and I was thinking, hey, if I can start something with Transnistria, and then the Russians have to come in to try and intervene to stop me from doing whatever I want in Transnistria, to, protect the people there and protect that breakaway government, maybe I could suck in, the Moldovan military, because, of course, that is Moldova, and I was hesitating as whether to say this at all, but there are rumors going around that there are Romanians training who are, planning on dressing like Moldovans, like Moldovan military, to fight the Ruskies in Transnistria. Again, all this sounds fishy to me. I didn't really want to repeat it, but whether they're real Moldovan troops or not, it would be a big deal if you saw Moldovan uniformed men fighting Russia, alongside the Ukrainians in Transnistria. That could potentially suck in NATO. And not like a NATO Article 5 thing. Again, a NATO country, Romania, which has strong ties to Moldova, for reasons I've already expressed, interfering to assist Moldova in a war against a much bigger country, Russia. Because, as much as there is a size and strength difference between Russia and Romania that is obvious, there's a major strength difference between Romania and Moldova. And the Romanians could see this, as an opportunity to try and reintegrate Moldova into their sphere and stop the advance of the Ruskies, because they don't want the Ruskies to have any more influence in Moldova than they already do. And in fact, they would want to push them out of there completely, go back to using the Roman alphabet, and begin the process of reintegrating Moldova, even if that includes Transnistria, into the Romanian state. So this is a dicey situation. I'm not too scared yet. I think that things could, this could be the end of it. This could have just been, hey, pinprick strike on something that is vaguely Russian, just like all the other pinprick strikes on Russia. But with that said, we don't want to see this war spreading into Moldova, even if it's just in Transnistria. We don't want it spreading into other countries. That is going to raise the risks of this becoming an actual world war.